Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Happy New Year. I speak on Bill C-14 this afternoon, legislation that, among other things, increases federal spending authority from a staggering $1.1 trillion to an astronomical $1.8 trillion. For a government that spends tens of billions of dollars here, hundreds of billions of dollars there, racks up a debt of more than $1 trillion, it's tough to keep track of exactly what $1.8 trillion means in context. And in that regard, my friend and colleague and former fellow Finance Committee member, the Honourable Member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley, put it in some important context yesterday when he spoke to Bill C-14. And in that regard, my colleague noted that in the more than 150 years since Canada's founding in 1867, total accumulated federal debt equaled $700 billion in the beginning of 2020. In the span of a single year, that debt level rose an astounding 50% to $1.1 trillion. And now, Madam Speaker, we have before us legislation that is contemplating and indeed would authorizing the debt ceiling to rise to $1.8 trillion. In other words, more than double the total accumulated debt since 1867, all within the span of a little more than a year. Now, Madam Speaker, if that is not sustainable, I frankly don't know what is. But yet, you wouldn't know that if one were to listen to the speeches from Liberal MPs across the way. They really seem to believe there is no issue and go on at great lengths to pat themselves on the back for the supposedly wonderful job that they have been doing since COVID, and more broadly in terms of the government's economic track record. Madam Speaker, if the metric by which to judge this government was on the basis of how much this government spent, this government absolutely could pat itself on the back, for it would get an A. But when it comes to delivering results for Canadians, one who is objective would be hard-pressed to give this government anything close to an A, for its track record, to say the least, has been wanting. This, after all, is a government that has delivered the second highest unemployment rate in the G7, save for the stagnant and socialist economy of Italy. This is a government that has delivered the slowest rate of economic growth in the G7, a government that has presided over a decline in terms of Canada's competitiveness. Under Prime Minister Harper's government, Canada was within the top 10 countries in the world in terms of competitiveness. We have now fallen to 17, and we are declining further. Madam Speaker, this is a government that has presided over a time when we have seen divestment from Canada, $160 billion of investment in the energy sector gone. And just in the last week, we saw a major pipeline project, the Keystone XL pipeline project canceled for the second time by the second U.S. administration under this Prime Minister's watch, and the Prime Minister barely could pick up the phone and call the new president to make the case for Keystone, as thousands of Canadians lost their jobs, including in my very hard-hit home province of Alberta. In terms of, Madam Speaker, consumption is set to grow at 5 times that of investment over the next 2 years. And as depressing as those economic numbers are, when one speaks of the massive deficit, the massive mountain of debt that has been accumulated, it isn't any rosier. Canada's debt to GDP ratio has hit a staggering 387%, having regard for government, personal, and corporate debt, by far and away the second highest in the G7, save only for Japan, which ekes us out at a little over 400%, hardly something that we should be aspiring to. When it comes to the federal debt to GDP ratio, Madam Speaker, the numbers are equally concerning, with the debt to GDP ratio climbing from 31% last year to 56% for next year. And again, Madam Speaker, sometimes when we talk about numbers, they need to be put in context. So what is the context of going from a 31% debt to GDP ratio to 56%? Well, Madam Speaker, the historical high was 66.6% in 1996, at a time when the Wall Street Journal ran the unflattering headline, Third World Banana Republic, in reference to Canada. And there was truth to that unfortunate headline, in as much as Canada was effectively bankrupt in 1996. No one, literally no one, would buy Canada's debt. And that, of course, resulted in very difficult decisions that had to be made in terms of significant cuts to social programs and in terms of transfers to the provinces by the former Chrétien Liberal government. Very simply put, Madam Speaker, why would we ever want to go back to those years? And yet, Madam Speaker, that is where we are headed if we stay on the current course. Now, it is true that right now interest rates are very low, around 1%. That is about the only thing that this government has going for it at the present time. However, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the former head of the Bank of Canada, in testimony before the Finance Committee, stated that interest rates are bound to go up in the foreseeable future, having regard for inflationary pressures. And really, that shouldn't be news to anyone. And so when one thinks about simply a 1% hike, let alone the average rate over the past number of decades being 5%, it's very difficult to imagine the cost of servicing now $1.1 trillion of debt, soon to be $1.8 trillion of debt, and if the government doesn't change course, over $2 trillion of debt. What Canadians need right now is more than a plan to spend money. We need a plan to get Canadians back to work, to get businesses open again, and to do it safely. And that includes a strategy around a vaccine distribution plan, and in that regard, this government has no plan. Canadians deserve to get their lives back. They deserve a plan from this government, and unfortunately, one has been sorely lacking. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
You know, Madam Speaker, I just heard this member go on for 10 minutes about the debt that's been incurred over the last 10 months as though he wasn't part of it. The reality is that he voted in favor at every single step of the way to spend this money, quite often through unanimous consent motions. All he had to do, and we know he doesn't have a problem speaking up when he feels like it, all he had to do when unanimous consent was brought forward was say no. And that would have triggered a whole series of events to get into the fine critiquing of every single spending measure. But no, he voted in favor of it at every step of the way. And quite frankly, it's getting tiring listening to Conservatives rail on and on about the debt all day long in here when they were part of spending that money over the last 10 months. How can this member possibly be so critical of it when he was right there every step of the way spending the money with us?
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Kingston and the Islands for his question. Let me first of all acknowledge that this is an extraordinary time and there has been some spending that has been required. I don't dispute that, and Conservatives have tried to work with the government to get dollars out to workers and to businesses and Canadians who need it. But that being said, it is also true that of the $375 billion in terms of deficit, only about $175 billion relates to direct COVID spending. So it is equally true that this government has a spending problem far beyond the necessary measures to help Canadians get through COVID. And quite frankly, I'm surprised the honourable member, as much as there has been some need for spending, would not be concerned about the fact that if we're going to reopen, we need to do so safely, and we need to get Canadians vaccinated. And this government has wholly failed on now the most important phase as we move into the next phase of COVID.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Happy New Year to you. Here's my question for my colleague. What does he think about the government's transparency at this point in time? The PBO has said that if the goal is to restart the economy and help it get back on its feet after the pandemic, then the government is not on track. What does the colleague think? St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And in response to my colleague from Abitibi-Témiscamingue, I would concur with the assessment of the PBO that the government has been less than transparent. It has been a long-standing problem that we have had with this government in terms of transparency. And that doesn't just relate to fiscal and economic issues. It also includes being straight with Canadians in terms of where Canada is in terms of the vaccine distribution plan. Where does Canada fit in terms of receiving vaccines relative to other countries? Are other vaccines beyond that of Pfizer part of the government's plan, and are we waiting for approval of such vaccines? Those are basic questions that lie with being open and transparent, something this government has not been.